Hello and welcome to the next part of the course. So here we're going to be looking at the real-world luxury watch manufacturing industry. We're going to be trying to draw out some interesting insights and lessons from the real world that we can then apply to the pre-seen case of Steelcast, and that will help us then hopefully to anticipate some of the issues and kinds of questions that might be arising in the case study exam in November. Just before we begin, if you're looking for full case study packs, mock exams, even free resources, head over to vivatuition.com. You'll find some of the best price SEMA offers on the market, and we've been getting really great feedback from our students on our materials. In our recent August survey, for example, we received an average satisfaction rating of 4.6 out of 5, compared to an average of 3.1 for other tuition providers. You can also subscribe free for access to a case study mini pack and financial ratios document for the November case. And one last thing, all our packs come with a lifetime pass guarantee as standard, so you can find all the details over on our website. Before I get into the details, let me just give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover in this industry analysis. So in the first section, we're going to look at what I call macro trends from a quantitative point of view. So I'll be taking the raw numbers and data and just looking at the trends over the recent years, and also some projections and what's expected to come in the next few years as well in the industry. So we'll move then from the quantitative to what I call the qualitative perspective, and we'll be trying to interpret some of the raw data and numbers. We're looking at some trends in terms of consumers and their behaviors, pricing, the retail model that's currently in play and how that might change, and various other factors from a qualitative point of view that will help us to understand some of the numbers that we've been looking at. In section 3 then, we're going to look at real world cases, some real companies in the luxury watch industry, most of which are based in Switzerland, as you may well be aware. And we're also going to look at this conglomerate versus independent or private company situation, which tends to dominate this sector. There's a lot of major conglomerates who own a number of very, very high reputation, prestigious luxury watch brands. And then you have other independent brands which are not owned by conglomerates and which are also very powerful in themselves. So we're going to be looking at the differences in terms of their manufacturing and the style of strategy that they have in terms of trying to either maintain or expand. Manufacturing then is something we're going to look at a little bit more detail as well. We're going to be looking at the process, how much of it is craft, and look at some of the costs involved and whether or not it's possible for this industry to streamline its manufacturing process in any way, or whether it's too restrictive and the requirements in terms of the mechanics and the attention to detail have limiting effects on the possibilities of cost cutting in this area. So that'll bring us then into section 5, where we'll be looking more broadly at opportunities and threats within this industry. We're going to be looking at issues pertaining to vertical integration, pricing, and indeed smart technology. And then section 6, we'll draw out some of the main conclusions, reflect on everything that's come before, and try and tie it all together in a way that will allow us to anticipate some of the kind of key topics and likely issues to come up in the case study exam in November. Okay, so let's get into it then. We're looking first here at global sales from 2005 to 2016, so more or less a 10-year period. As you can see here, around the middle of the previous decade, we had a slump just after 2005 going into 2010. Not surprisingly, perhaps, in light of the financial crisis. And then it began to pick up again around 2011, 2012, with quite substantial growth figures there in those years. And since around 2014, 2013, that growth, that global growth in sales has slowed somewhat. We're going to come back to that, and we're going to be analysing why exactly that is the case. Nevertheless, there has been still continued growth, even if it is much, much more modest in the last couple of years. As you can see there, it really trails off. So we're going now into the regional breakdown, and this is from 2013 to 2015, a smaller time scale, but you can see there have been quite substantial drops in sales growth in certain segments. Most conspicuously, as you can see here, we can look at Hong Kong and China. These are major markets, of course, really, really big global markets. And they've seen substantial sales growth reductions. The value of sales growth percentage decline there for Hong Kong and China has been very, very substantial indeed. And we're going to come back to that in the next section and explain exactly why that might be the case. And here we're looking at Swiss exports, and Switzerland, obviously, as I mentioned, is the key country in this industry. Most of the major global luxury watch manufacturers are based in Switzerland or have associations with Switzerland, as we'll see in section 3. But look here, you can see this is from 1984 to 2016, and we're looking at the percentage change year on year in exports from Switzerland, from Swiss companies. You can see at the beginning, or sorry, I should say around the middle to the late period of the last decade, again, unsurprisingly, a huge drop there during the financial crisis. And then you had a recovery in the next few years. But if we're looking at the more recent years, as I suggested in the previous slide, we're seeing again this drop, and it's been in a large part based on developments in China, which we're going to look at very soon. But overall, even in Europe and in the United States, markets have generally been slowing down. Here's a more detailed look at the Chinese situation. You can see there was a really healthy growth, a very rapid growth from 2007 until 2012 as a new rich elite emerged in China. And you can see then very suddenly and quite dramatically from 2012, 13 and 14, it just completely flatlined the growth, and it's recovered somewhat in 2015, but then another decline in 2016, although that was based on a best estimate at the time. But it actually has materialized in that way. It has actually dropped significantly from 2015 to 2016 again in China, based on many interesting political developments and indeed cultural and consumer developments as well, trends that have been emerging over the last 2 to 3 years in China that indicate that there may be some substantial changes ahead. So China, really important market, because it has really lifted the luxury watch industry from the mid-2000s until recent years. It was the major source of sustained growth and revenues and profits indeed for Swiss luxury watch manufacturers, and that's looking now like it might be running out of steam a little bit, and that's going to cause some serious concern, of course, for these companies. We'll come back to this and what this means in terms of strategy going forward, but we're going to stick with the raw numbers just for now. And here's another interesting development. This is the luxury goods market online in general. Okay, so now luxury goods takes in a whole lot of different kinds of products, of course. You have cars, you have yachts, you have mansions and things like that, and real estate and property. So we're looking here at a very broad market, but luxury goods, a lot of them do have various things in common in terms of pricing and consumer perceptions and so on, and the kinds of people who are likely to purchase. And we're seeing since 2003 a very rapid growth in the online sector. This is very important for all luxury goods manufacturers, and it's no different, of course, for luxury watchmakers, as we'll see. Very strong year-on-year growth of this online personal luxury goods market from 2003 to 2016. Now, let's get into some of these projections here. This is from the Euromonitor International, and they have compared two different but related segments: luxury timepieces, which is just another way of saying luxury watches, and autonomous wearable electronics, which in some cases it's simply referred to as smartwatches, although it does take into account other wearable devices which have an electronic or technological component. But primarily, we're speaking here about smartwatches, and we're going to come back to smartwatches a little bit later on. But in terms of retail volume, you can see that the autonomous wearable electronics have far outstripped and are projected to far outstrip the luxury timepieces. You can see here the luxury timepieces. By comparison, it looks very undramatic and underwhelming. We're seeing more or less flat projections from Euromonitor International, maybe very marginal growth at the very best, but certainly when you compare it to the growth of the autonomous wearable electronics, it's looking kind of bleak, it has to be said, for the luxury watch manufacturers. Now, this may be a little bit of a misleading characterization, a little bit of a misleading graph, and for reasons that we'll come back to in the next section. the projected lack of growth may not be so fatal for the luxury watch industry, and we'll see for why that is, because there are kind of contradictions that emerge when you analyze this industry. It's very, very interesting because growth is something that is a little bit of a mixed bag from the perspective of any given individual luxury watch manufacturer. So we'll come back to that. Very, very interesting point and interesting perspective. But if you're looking at the raw numbers, this is what we're projecting, and this is what many experts who are analysing the industry are projecting over the next 5 to 6 years. Here again, we see another projection. This is from Business Insider Intelligence. They're comparing again Apple Watches, which is kind of an indicator of the popularity of smartwatches. And they're projecting out from 2014 to 2020, so a similar time period. Relatively modest growth expected for luxury watches and more considerable growth for Apple Watches and smartwatches. But as you can see, there is a slowdown expected somewhat for Apple Watches in terms of their growth from 2015, 2016. It's healthy, very, very strong going into 2017. But then things begin to trail off a little bit in 2018 and 19 and 20. Now, of course, these are projections. These are our industry analysts' best guesses. Educated guesses. You always have to take these things with a pinch of salt because, of course, political and economic factors can very rapidly change, and this can completely change the nature of any given industry. So this is something that has to be taken into account, but based on the best analysis of the best experts, we're looking at modest growth at best for luxury watches in the coming years, if not, in fact, a flat growth trend from now until around 2020. Now, 2016 was considered to be a very bad year from the perspective of luxury watch manufacturers. Despite projections of modest growth, as we saw in the previous slides over the next 5 years, 2016 was considered by many in the industry to have been a very bad year indeed, and one of the worst in recent history of the industry. The big Swiss brands, which is most of the luxury watch manufacturers, saw significant declines in profits as emerging markets, it seems, showed continued signs of slowdowns, and that includes China, as was mentioned. Overall, Swiss watch exports fell by 10%, which was quite considerable. So we're moving now into the qualitative. We want to analyse these numbers and kind of give them a little bit more sense and to understand exactly why it is the case that we've been seeing these trends. Now, we're starting with China because that is obviously a huge market for almost every product, but no different for luxury goods, as the new Chinese rich and the new wealthy in that country tend to be very interested in displaying their wealth and their newfound riches in a more conspicuous way. They want to get the luxury items, the status symbols, and so on. That's been a trend over the last 10 years or so in China. So you can see here, things have begun, it seems, to change a little bit in the last 3 to 4 years, as was indicated by the raw numbers. And there are a number of factors that seem to be playing into this. One is very much political, and you can see here it says Xi Jinping, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, China's authoritarian leader, has cracked down on political rivals suspected of corruption, discouraged ostentatious displays of wealth, and turned Chinese tourists off shopping abroad by levying heavier duties on those who return with armfuls of Hermes bags. So we're talking here in general about the luxury goods industry overall, but this of course affects the luxury watch industry as well. So in general, we're seeing a kind of a move against these ostentatious displays of wealth, but also there has been this crackdown on corruption, which was mentioned actually in the pre-scene, in one of the press clippings at the end of the pre-scene. That certainly things in China are changing in terms of the attitudes and approaches to gifting things like luxury watches in business deals, because this can be interpreted as corruption or bribery, and in fact often these kinds of gifts are indeed used in that way. So China seems to be turning against this kind of tradition and indeed calling it out as bribery and corruption, and this is obviously going to create something of a stigma for these kinds of gifts. And often luxury watches and many other luxury goods were what were used to influence deals like this, and business deals and deals between, for example, political figures and private business owners. So there's been a clampdown, and that has, it seems, had a significant effect and impact on luxury watch sales in China. There are also broader consumer trends which have been indicative of a substantial change in the next few years. There are changing tastes, it seems, among Chinese consumers in general. They have increasingly been shunning big and shiny logos and the kind of ostentatious displays of wealth that were more popular over the last 10 years, say from the mid-2000s to the 2014, 2015. And in the last 2 to 3 years, then things have been changing, it seems, somewhat, as Chinese consumers are moving now more towards cheap, fast fashion items, with fewer luxury pieces being coveted. And so, again, obviously, that's going to have a significant impact on luxury watch sales as well. Here's an interesting little piece of data relating to China and smartwatches in particular. You can see here 79% of Chinese luxury watch consumers, that is Chinese consumers who have already bought a luxury watch, also express a desire to buy a smartwatch. That's 79%, so that's a quite substantial percentage. Now, it may be argued, of course, that the smartwatch is distinct from this luxury watch market and that there's not really competition. And the argument goes that because consumers of luxury watches tend to have a huge amount of disposable income, there's nothing stopping them from buying both a luxury watch and a smartwatch, that there isn't really the same kind of degree of price sensitivity and price restriction. But I'm going to come back to that because there is an argument that that is something of a misconception, and that in fact even luxury brand and luxury watch consumers are in some ways price sensitive and may indeed forego buying one kind of watch if they decide to buy another kind of watch, even if they're buying within the luxury category. So we're going to come back to this because this is really important from the perspective of a strategy for a luxury watch manufacturer. Here we see that the smartwatch industry, while it did see considerable increases in popularity in 2013, 2014 and those years, we actually have been seeing a slowdown also in that area and in that segment. Smartwatches, despite initial significant interest and popularity, it seems that that's beginning to flatten out as well. Wearable technology, tech market, the sector has failed to live up to expectations in the last 2 to 3 years. And so even though there will be an argument made that smartwatches are indeed a potential threat to luxury watch manufacturers, it's not growing as rapidly, quite as rapidly as it had done in 2012, 13 and 14, when there was a huge amount of investment and interest in these kinds of wearable technologies. Whereas now the excitement seems to be subsiding somewhat, and it remains a threat, but perhaps not as great a threat as it was once considered. Now, here's a really interesting factor that has emerged in recent years, and this is according to the analysis of one writer who's very, very well read and well regarded in this industry. We're going to be looking at some of his comments in the next few slides, and he has identified what he calls a substantial grey market in this industry, and that this is having a dampening effect on sales in the industry for many very interesting reasons. So according to him and many other industry analysts, an online grey market has negatively affected sales. The old retail model of officially certified or authorized stores, and this is something that we saw in the pre-scene, is in conflict with online sales trends according to these analysts. Now, this is something that this theory wasn't really indicated in the pre-scene, but it certainly is something in the real-world industry that has gotten analysts and insiders within the industry very concerned indeed. And they do anticipate that there will be changes based on the fact that we're seeing this old retail model being challenged significantly and substantially within the online sales segment. This is really the key, is that consumer perceptions have been negatively affected, and indeed trust, it seems, is a big issue here, and it has been undermined based on the fact that the old retail model is kind of not really doing its job in the current environment, the online environment. So we're going to be looking at this now in a little bit more detail. You can see here, this is Ariel Adams. He is the industry analyst and expert that I mentioned, and he's written extensively on the luxury watch industry. I'm going to be including some of his links and sources at the end of this presentation, but his work is widely available online. I do highly recommend that you take a look at it if you're more interested in looking into more detail on any of these points. And he's written extensively on the reasons why we've been seeing this kind of potential crisis in the last few years for luxury watch manufacturers and the slowdown in China and elsewhere. He says the same timepiece might be available at any given time online via a series of different retailers for vastly different prices, and this has had the effect of eroding consumer confidence. What tends to happen, in other words, is that luxury watch manufacturers in the current model, they act as wholesalers, and they'll sell a large number of their watches to these authorized or partnered retailers, the traditional stores, luxury stores in upmarket areas. And they will have a recommended retail price, which will be in general quite high. And what will happen is that if the retailers struggle to sell all of their inventory, they might move on those items that they cannot sell, or the items, for example, that might be out of season, and they will shift them on to other retailers who might not be officially authorized, and these will then in turn find their way onto the online market. And what will tend to happen then is these prices will plummet quite significantly, and this is the grey area that the grey market that Ariel Adams has identified is the online market, where the same watches that are available in the officially certified retail stores are online as well for substantially lower prices. And so what this causes consumers to do, or potential consumers, is to stay in what he calls a constant holding pattern prior to buying, because they see that there is a wide variety and variability in prices for luxury watches. And so what they will tend to do is they will hold off until they see the price bottom out, so to speak. And the problem with this, of course, is that they never know when the price has bottomed out. Often you'll see these consistently declining prices for luxury watches from, say, $10,000 down to $8,000, down to $7,000. And the question is, well, when does this stop? And often what happens is consumers will just be caught in this constant holding pattern and actually never get around to buying the watch in question. They'll just put it off until such a point that they maybe forget about it, or they wait for a new model to be released. And this is causing a lot of problems in the luxury watch industry and dampening demand. So watch brands are still operated as commodity wholesalers, as I said, and watchmakers with a more vertically integrated sales model, according to Ariel Adams, are far less prone to having wildly varying prices available in the retail marketplace, and especially the online marketplace. And so they are rewarded then with increased trust from consumers. We're going to come back to this. This is really interesting from the perspective of opportunities, which we'll look at in the penultimate section of this analysis. So we've seen this kind of contradiction or tension within the industry. There's been a relatively high performance of online watch retail, but the luxury watch manufacturers themselves actually aren't necessarily benefiting from this, because of course they tend to still deal only directly with the retailers, the officially certified retailers and the kind of traditional stores in upmarket areas. And they're avoiding directly selling to customers online in general. And so what's happening is that those kinds of the price drops that we're seeing online are not really they're not really translating as extra profits or revenues for the luxury watch manufacturers themselves. So the kings of watch sales, according to Ariel Adams, today are actually the unauthorized retailers and mostly online retailers. Now, I mentioned the price sensitivity issue earlier on, and again, according to Ariel Adams, this is something of a myth actually when it comes to luxury watch and luxury product hunters. He makes the claim that even luxury shoppers are actually bargain hunters, and that if you can get the same watch for $8,000 instead of $10,000 or $12,000, that's still a significant saving. And if there's a perception that there are these kinds of variations and there's this significant movement in prices comparing the official retailers with the online retailers or unauthorized retailers, there's going to be a tendency for even these high-end luxury shoppers with lots of disposable income to hold off and to go for the lower priced option if it's available. So traditionally, with the certified authorized retailers, there was this romanticized notion of a luxury shopping experience where the person would go into this shop, they would be treated very well, they would be shown all of the different models, everything would be explained in person, the mechanisms, the tradition, the craft. They might be given a glass of champagne, for example, while they're being attended to by the salesperson. And this was obviously something that many people would have valued and would have appreciated, but at least Ariel Adams is arguing here that this romanticized notion is actually of limited appeal, and that ultimately, when push comes to shove, even luxury watch consumers will be willing to forego or to avoid that kind of experience if it means that they're going to pay $2,000 or $3,000 less for a watch by purchasing through an online or an unauthorized retailer. There's also this contradiction, which I indicated in the previous slides, that in fact growth and increased profits and revenues in this industry are not always necessarily a good thing, at least not in the short term. And there's this really kind of strong tension within this industry between short-term growth on the one hand and sustainable long-term, much more modest growth on the other hand. And it seems in many cases that actually if you grow too rapidly in terms of revenues and sales as a luxury watch manufacturer, this can actually be harmful to your long-term interests and long-term survival. And the reason, of course, is because if a luxury watch becomes too popular and actually begins to sell very, very extensively and widely, that actually affects the perception of the watch as a luxury brand and as an exclusive brand. So exclusivity really is absolutely key in this industry. And in many ways, there's kind of a contradiction, and luxury watch manufacturers will want to actually limit their sales in many ways. And it's a really interesting question strategically, just how much is the optimal trade-off between these different kinds of impulses. On the one hand, of course, as a private company and as a capitalist enterprise, luxury watch manufacturers will want to make as much money as possible. However, on the other hand, they won't want to actually necessarily shift as many items as they possibly can. They will want to restrict the production of their products in such a way that it maintains that kind of exclusivity and that status symbol in order to be able to continue selling as at the prices that they have been selling up until now. So that's a really, really interesting strategic question to consider. And there's a lot of debate within this industry about how far and how much these companies should expand. Generally, the rule of thumb is that luxury watch manufacturers should be tracking general economic growth. And so, in other words, they shouldn't be looking to grow rapidly in for example, an established economy, because then that would indicate that there's a potential loss of the status symbol and the loss of exclusivity. What they want to do is they want to tap into emerging markets in general and kind of get in to the new rich markets as quickly as possible, and kind of benefit from a first mover advantage in those markets. And then that will allow them to grow in a way that's at least short-term sustainable without actually negatively or adversely affecting their perception of exclusivity, because of course in those newly emerging markets, the rich will still be a relatively small number. And so even if they start selling considerably in those new emerging markets relative to how they sold before, it's not necessarily going to undermine the perception of status and exclusivity that they associate with their brand.